Hey guys, and welcome back to the Youth Action Hub podcast. I am one of your hosts, Annalise Janke.
I'm Evelyn Derrer.
I'm Mustafaa Munir.
And today, along with our usual hosts, we have a very special guest, our good friend,
Ana Gaston.
Hi, Ana.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today. So, we're just going to we'll ask you a couple of questions, just so the audience can kind of get to know you a little bit. So, you go to Fishers High School with all of us, and you are a senior.
Yes.
You had some very big accomplishments this past year. You just became was it state champion of Congress?
Yeah. Yes.
Which is pretty cool. You also went to Girls State and you were president for Girls State, and then you went on to Girls Nations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was president at Girls Nation, and then at Girls State I was a representative in our mock legislature.
There we go. So yeah, I cannot think of anybody more qualified to be here today talking about anything that we're talking about. So thank you so much for being here with us. Let's see, guys, what other questions should we ask to kind of familiarize the audience with Ana? Since we like to take the international and bring it local, it's one of our goals here at the Youth Action Hub in the USA. You are very well traveled and have dual citizenship. Would you like to elaborate on that a little?
Yeah. So my mom is Brazilian, which means that I have Brazilian citizenship as well as American citizenship. But then on top of that, I have a cousin who lives in Washington, D.C. right now, but he works for the embassy. So because of that, they're moving around every 3 years and working in different embassies internationally, which means I've been very lucky. I've been able to travel to Peru and then also visited some places in Europe. And we've already started planning our trip to visit them in South Korea when they move next year. So very excited.
That's so cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What's your favorite place that you've visited?
Probably Brazil, just because I love the culture and the people there. I just think that so often, I think you kind of get this perception of what a country's like. And with Brazil especially, it's this like carnival, like party. Everyone's always, not wearing clothes in the streets, but it's definitely not what it's like. It's just a people that have this vibrancy and this passion for life. The Brazilian culture is very focused on just not only living your life to the fullest, but also ensuring that everything you're doing and every second of your time that you're spending is something that's going to make you happy. And also it's a predominantly Catholic country. So obviously considering their religion into it as well and creating that moral code. But I just think there's this like passion and vibrancy that's in Brazil that I haven't seen anywhere else I've been, or not quite to the same extent.
That's awesome.
That's awesome,
And
yeah.
also the food is amazing.
That's so true.
We brought in cheese bread to our English class a while ago,
so
which was
good.
so good. And then also brigadeiros, am I pronouncing that right?
Brigadeiros are so good.
Yeah. It's like chocolate, I don't even know how to describe it.
It's sweet condensed milk mixed with melted down chocolate, and then you roll them into little fudge balls basically and roll them around in chocolate sprinkles. It's so good.
Yeah, you're going to have to teach me how to do that. So,
Yes.
all right. Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Ana. So today we are going to be talking about the coronavirus as well as some elections that are going on not only in the U.S. but also around the world. So to kind of start us off with our coronavirus conversation, I wanted to lead with a little bit of a joke.
Yes.
You guys know that Justin Bieber, he came out and he has Lyme disease. He was just diagnosed with Lyme disease. Well, it'd be really unfortunate. I'm already seeing facial expressions. It'd be really unfortunate if he also got corona disease, because then Justin Bieber would have Lyme and corona diseases. You get it?
Yes.
Yeah,
I love that.
Thank you. I
You're
appreciate
absolutely hilarious.
that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I really appreciate that.
Well, yeah, obviously, like a lot of us, at least here in the U.S., have been taking Corona as a meme, as a joke. And, Evelyn and I just got out of a meeting for an international conference we're going to next week for Model United Nations. And it's a serious concern. They're not letting anybody from China come. They refunded all their money. And if anyone is sick, they're not allowed to bring us to Chicago. And there's going to be face masks and a lot of hand sanitizer provided. And it just, the realization that this is actually real and it, you know, actually could affect us is really daunting per se.
It's insane. And I think, yeah, you mentioned like we kind of take it as like a meme, but we kind of, that very, very much shows our privilege that we can kind of laugh about it. But also, you know, there's starting to be more and more cases that are popping up in the U.S. And while it might not be worth like a huge freak out, there are precautions that are being taken. And yeah, it kind of hits home whenever you're realizing like, oh, if I get sick, I cannot go to this Model UN thing because like people are going to freak out that I have corona.
And if you do get sick, they have to put you in quarantine until
Oh,
they make sure you're not like, you know, infectious to anybody else.
fun times.
It's very daunting.
In econ, we were watching the CNN 10 student news, and they were talking about how dangerous coronavirus actually can be because it to the average person necessarily might not be something that can kill you. It wouldn't be lethal, but because there's specifically seeing a lot of cases with the elderly where they have weaker immune systems, it becomes very, very dangerous. And so I think that's why maybe it hasn't gotten as much attention as Ebola or Zika did when we first had those outbreaks, because it feels like unless you're part of a more specific group, it won't kill you, but it does spread extremely quickly. And the fact that it kind of came out of nowhere, which wasn't the same way that we saw the Zika and Ebola outbreak happen, is what's kind of made it something that we should be a bit more concerned about.
For sure. I think also today was the first case in the U.S. where the coronavirus was spread in like person-to-person contact. There's a man who infected his wife with it. And it's like, so it's like it's moving kind of slowly, but we're starting to get like a little bit more nervous. Like the heat's getting turned up a little bit. I also think it's interesting that you brought up Zika, because actually today in math class that we're both in, we were talking about how Zika, didn't you say that your uncle had Zika?
Yeah. Okay. It's wild because you only ever hear stories about how Zika affects pregnant women, which obviously does create birth defects. But my uncle had Zika. It was not really all that dangerous at all, but he did have a really bad rash. And it was just like a really painful experience. But I think it was because in certain places of Brazil, it was just like popping up and not going away. And my cousin was having a baby at the time, so it was very scary. But yeah, I think Zika may have been a bit over-exaggerated of how bad the outbreak was, at least in Brazil. It was definitely something to be scared of, but I think the news kind of took the story and ran with it as far as...
Yeah. And a lot of times with outbreaks and pandemics and epidemics, like information is such a key to like how these diseases spread. I know in the Wuhan region, the CCP was, you know, doing malicious things to journalists who were trying to, you know, show the world that this virus was outbreaking, and it caused the virus to be even worse than what it could have been if they were controlled on time. And, you know, in recent years, we've had a lot of misinformation in the medical field, and that's caused like an anti-vax movement to spread out. And that's, you know, weakened herd immunity because people who actually cannot get vaccines are being harmed by those who willingly choose not to because of the misinformation that's been spreading around in a lot of recent years. And that goes with a lot of the fake news stuff, which affects really a lot of walks of life.
I think a number of these issues all have accumulated into this case of the coronavirus, and especially now, as we've sort of said before, and with the World Health Organization declaring it an emergency, that now we feel it more personally. And because it's grown so much and we just don't know the ramifications of it yet, that we're still on the beginning edge of it and need to continue to learn more about it.
I think then like all of those points of conversation bring us to a question of like, are we handling this correctly? Because the coronavirus has become something that you mentioned the word corona and everybody's like, oh my gosh, the coronavirus, I heard this, I heard this, I heard this. We're here talking about it now. But, you know, that's what you were saying, like, journalists got this out and it kind of worsened the situation a little bit. And Anna, you were mentioning how like Zika kind of got overhyped, for lack of a better term. Is the coronavirus, are we blowing this up to be bigger than it is? Like you said, it's really it is dangerous, but especially for people who are older with weaker immune systems, maybe we don't all need to be freaking out quite so much. Like Evelyn was saying, like, we don't know a whole lot about this yet. So what should we do going forward, not only in the international community, but in our local community to kind of treat those who have the coronavirus with care while also protecting everybody and educating everybody adequately?
I know a number of people have been like saying, whether as a joke or just completely uninformed, that there's been disease in this area, even at the other high school in our district. And while sure it could be a funny joke, as soon as it spreads and someone believes it's true, it becomes incredibly dangerous that this misinformation can be just circulated so quickly. The other thing we've seen is forced quarantine, especially in areas of China that have, whether or not this works, we have yet to see if it will continue to spread despite this quarantine. But also there's the stigma around the quarantine that, oh, because you're in this area, you're immediately dangerous, or you have to be separated from your family, which can make it even worse for the people fighting this disease who may not even die from it, but they still have to face the same situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And just educating the public again on, like, safety, washing your hands and all the things that you hear again and again. And also, just informing the public about, like, the real, like, proven sciences, vaccines aren't actually harmful, and, like, the anti-vax movement should be countered by things like that. Because although there isn't a vaccine for corona, if it ever did come, to fruition, that anti-vax movement would be very much of a roadblock in trying to, like, vaccinate people against the virus.
I feel like also it comes down to making sure that the people who actually need treatment are the people who are getting it. It's really easy for us to hear that there have been 5 cases in the United States now and think, oh, we need to, start doing this mass quarantine like Evelyn was talking about. But really, it's more of how can the United States and other countries in the global community pitch in to make sure that the medicine and technology we have here and in other countries is getting to the places where they don't have the same technology, because the quicker that we can stop it from spreading and becoming an issue in China is going to help it stop spreading to other countries and becoming a worldwide problem.
Exactly. This is where that idea of, we all function as separate countries, but sometimes humanity comes first. And this is a time where, like, whenever we saw the Ebola outbreaks, doctors from the Western world and from all over the Eastern world came together and tried to do what they could to bring their own medical expertise and try to fight Ebola and kind of get that under control as much as possible. And so if we can do the same thing here, I think you're right, this is a time for the international community to come together.
Yeah, and part of that would be to recognize, the concepts like, physician burnout, because it's been very bad in the Wuhan region. I remember reading an article a couple days ago that doctors and nurses are wearing adult diapers because they don't not have the time to take off all their, like, hazmat gear to go to the restroom. They have to constantly be going from patient to patient. And, having that infrastructure there, having the support there from other physicians and nurses is very important.
Wow. You could not pay me to do that. That's a lot.
No.
All right. So, are we good with coronavirus? We feel like we've solved all the world's problems on that.
No, definitely.
Wonderful.
Perfectly.
Yeah, so you wouldn't get on that, please. So now let's touch on something a little bit, I don't know, this is a little bit more controversial. We've got elections coming up. I don't know how controversial it'll be in this group before, but I know in our country, the U.S., we are very divided right now. The Iowa caucuses are
Next month.
Yeah. So coming up very soon, and if we have any international listeners, the Iowa caucuses kind of kick off the whole election process. I think Iowa is the only state that caucuses.
One of the only, I think.
There might be.
It's the most important because it's the first, and it sort of sets the stage for the idea of what this country is voting for. And from the time that we're recording this, it's only 4 days away. So we've definitely seen sort of the implications of that, both in media presence of the candidates and what the candidates are saying and doing to encourage voters to vote for them.
Definitely. And so with caucusing, I believe you go and there's a physical, you stand in different areas of a room to kind of show who you support. And if you don't do well in Iowa, you're not going to do well in other countries. So it is very important. So I think let's definitely touch on that. And then we can also kind of get into international elections and kind of what's going on with the rest of the world. Which
I mean, in a sense, the U.S. presidential election is an international election because of the U.S.'s historical role in world affairs. The election of our president has implications for every other nation on this world because in some way or shape or form, the U.S. has, shaped, either for better or for worse, other countries in this planet.
Yeah, and I think the same could, be said about elections in the UK, and we're seeing a lot of large world powers are starting to, change who's in charge, and depending on what party is now in charge really affects how our international trade deals are going to go and how, are we going to get ourselves into a war?
Yeah.
I know specifically there's a little bit of talk about whether the Iowa caucuses, about whether Iowa should actually be first, because I think in the past we've always said, oh, Iowa is a very indicative state of the rest of the country. If you can win these pretty middle of the line voters who can swing either way, then that'll say how you're going to do in a lot of the other swing states, which are typically what that election comes down to. And New Hampshire is the second state, which is also this idea of if you can win New Hampshire, then you should be able to win the entire country. But I just don't know how much that's true anymore. And I think there's kind of discussion on whether or not Iowa really is as indicative as we've said it is, because if we just look to the 2016 election, Ted Cruz actually won the Iowa caucuses for the Republican Party, yet wasn't who the Republicans ended up backing following the primary and into the general election. And that's happened a few times before, where someone may win the Iowa caucuses, but then after that, just something happens. If we look back to Bush, we see the same thing happen with the Democratic Party, where one scream, and after that, it completely switched on who was going to be the candidate going into the general election. So I think, as time goes forward and as the voter bases are more diverse, I don't know if Iowa and New Hampshire are really all that indicative of the rest of the country anymore.
Yeah, Iowa, so I have their demographics pulled up, and they are 90.28% white, Black or African American 3.51%, Asian 2.40%, and then it says like two or more races 2.10%. So that's not very indicative of our country. And so it is interesting. Iowa, I have heard that people are like, oh, well, you've got rural, but you've also got some other areas. And for being a rural area, there are some more liberal people. And I think that there's a lot of work that goes into, there's a culture in Iowa. I've been listening to a podcast by the Crooked Media Group that's really, really good. And it kind of goes into the Iowa caucuses and why Iowa of all places. And those who have grown up in Iowa, there's kind of this... they take on this responsibility. They acknowledge that they have a huge say in the election. And so, Anna, like you were mentioning, while it's not always super indicative, it can be pretty important how you do in the Iowa caucus. And so, there's so much campaigning that goes on that Iowans are pretty open-minded, and they try to kind of listen to those who are campaigning, and they really take that role seriously, which, we appreciate. But whenever you look at the numbers, it's not indicative, and maybe we should be switching. Maybe the states can take turns and switch who gets to go first, which sounds weird, but our country is shifting and changing, and we have this new wave of voters who like our age, and we look different than Iowa.
Yeah, and I believe all of us will be voting for the first time in the presidential election this year.
So excited.
But we have seen this shift over the last couple of years, and just the current climate around the president, and having going into this election year that we know we're rearing up for another election year with all the pros and cons that come with it, especially the cons. And just knowing that this year it's going to affect us personally because we get to vote is, I know for me personally, I've been paying more attention and knowing what's going on, which has opened my eyes to that.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we've kind of touched a little bit on that, and I'm sure in future podcast episodes we will return to this because it's going to be a fun year. I think let's also kind of get into, I'm less educated about this area, but those more international elections. Do you guys have anything to say about what's going on in the rest of the world?
Yeah, apparently this morning, where it would be a little different compared to like time zones. Scotland has recently tried to propose a referendum to declare independence from the UK, and there's a lot of talk because
For real.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson's party is the ruling party of the UK at the moment, that they won't let Scotland do it. But if you just, look at it like from an outsider perspective, if the UK wants to violate, a contract with Scotland by Brexit, that Scotland should have the right to choose, do they want to stay in the EU or not?
First was Brexit, now it's Skexit. Am I right?
Skexit does not have the same ring to it.
Brexit has affected, I feel like, so many elections and will continue to affect so many elections because, with the recent British election, like Boris Johnson's party ran completely on the get Brexit done.
Mm-hmm.
They completely ignored some of the other issues. Like they were the opposing party was really focusing on healthcare, and Boris Johnson's just sitting there like, nah, just get her done. And that was his whole mentality. But Brexit affects so many more countries because now that the United Kingdom is actually going through with the process to leave the European Union, this is going to mean a lot as far as trade deals. Like, will the United States be able to form a trade deal that wasn't possible previously due to the different, EU standards? And also the UK is getting very close with China right now as well, specifically when it comes to technology. They're trading a lot in that sector. So Brexit has kind of had this ripple effect, and I think it's going to affect other elections. It was the reason that Boris Johnson's party gained power, and it's going to be the reason that a lot of other leaders are elected in different elections because now Brexit's making everyone respond differently.
Yeah, there's an implication because of the increase in seats by Boris Johnson's party right before the election. I believe the title is minority leader of the minority party. Jeremy Corbyn showed the UK and the world leaked documents from Boris Johnson's party that they were planning on maybe having a trade deal with the United States that would sell the National Health Service in the UK to the United States, to pharmaceutical and big pharma per se. And that would cause the UK to start having the after effects of the US's healthcare, which it's a very controversial subject because of our high costs. And having that would definitely not make any Briton proud or happy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And especially because that could change with our election coming up, depending on which candidate is elected, because many of the Democratic candidates especially have been focusing on this idea of healthcare, that now that we see both sides of it between the UK and the US, there's definitely more considerations.
Well, that's actually a really interesting part of the EU standards, because when it comes to food, their standards are so much more strict than the United States. But when it comes to healthcare, there are quite a few different drugs that the FDA even refuses to look at. And so I know that there's been specifically a recent problem where, because Canada has the same standards and is able to trade with the European Union, that drugs from Canada have come down into the United States through the black market. So I'm wondering if President Trump's deal with Boris Johnson were to go through and he were to have a free trade deal with the United Kingdom, would that curb that issue, since now, you don't have to go through the black market, the drug's actually more readily available? Or would it exacerbate the problem because now we're having to address some of our food and drug standards in order to match those of the United Kingdom?
I think that's a very interesting issue to bring up. And while obviously I can't answer that question because it's too complicated for me, it is interesting, should we maybe all adjust, how our governments, what we perceive as acceptable food for people to consume or acceptable medications. I know that in the US, this is incredibly random, but our teeth whitening treatments have a much higher percentage of bleach or active chemicals that then
Scary.
are allowed in other countries. And so kind of like whenever you start to think about that, like you were saying, like our food standards are different, but also our medicine standards are different and in different ways. And yeah, there's those black market issues, and it's like, well, maybe if we could all just kind of like equalize it, could that help? We don't know.
I believe the UN, either through the UN itself or the WHO, has a list of like drugs they think are permissible or not permissible for use, similar to like the schedule system here in the US. And a big problem of that here in the US at least is that any drug that's like a lower schedule, which would mean it's worse off for consumption and can't really be used, is that a lot of these drugs can't really readily be researched. And because of different standards with some of these controversial drugs such as marijuana, MDMA, and LSDs, and other psychedelics, is that there can't really be an international cooperation in research into these drugs. And a lot of these drugs actually do have like good proven medical like effects. Microdosing on psychedelics has had implications for PTSD patients, and MDMA was recently certified for testing only for PTSD patients here in the United States. But if we were in line with other countries, especially a lot of European countries who have like weaker standards per se, but not in a bad way, we would be able to have an international cooperation, which we currently cannot have.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we are kind of at a point where we'll kind of do some ending updates about the Youth Action Hub and kind of what's going on. So we are starting our application process within the next month, which is very exciting. So we're going to have some fresh voices. Hopefully Anna will, get on that train. So we'll have some more people and kind of get involved. So Mustafaa and I are graduating next year. Evelyn will be staying at FHS, but we are going to continue the Youth Action Hub. So we are, moving forward full throttle. And we also have Pete, which you guys haven't heard from him since our first episode, but he is still hanging around. He just went through a big move, so we're kind of doing the podcast thing on our own right now, but he's still around as well. We are also really getting more into our social medias. So we have an Instagram, which is at Youth Action Hub USA, all lowercase, and you can feel free to check that out. There is a very small chance that name might need to change, and if so, we will update you in our next podcast episode. And then I believe our Twitter is Youth Action Hub Noblesville.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. And so we can have more information in the bio of this podcast or in the description. But yeah, just kind of some updates. So thank you guys so much for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed our conversation, and we will see you guys next time.